If it weren't for the huge caption at the bottom of this picture, you'd probably have no idea who this is. But Michelangelo was a painter of the Italian Renaissance, one of many. He is perhaps one of the most well-known artists in the world today, though. Many people have heard of Michelangelo, but some of the other artists of his time include Bellini, Botticelli, Da Vinci, Donatello, and Raphael. The work of these great artists had a lasting impact on the world even centuries after they passed away, but there are some things that set Michelangelo apart from all the rest. But first, let's back up a couple steps. You may be wondering what exactly Italian Renaissance is. The word Renaissance is actually derived from a French word meaning rebirth. The Renaissance time period lasted from 1450 to 1600 and was between the medieval and the Baroque time periods. During the Renaissance, Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation took place. This was in 1517. The Counter-Reformation then took place in 1545. In the early 1500s, the first printing press was also invented. This should give you a better idea of what was going on during this time period. Now that you have a better understanding of this very specific time period, we can move on to the topic at hand, Michelangelo. I mentioned before that there are certain things about Michelangelo as a person which set him apart from the other artists of his time. Some of these things go clear back to his childhood, so that is where I will begin. As a young child, Michelangelo was immediately recognized as a prodigy. His father enrolled him in grammar school when Michelangelo was 10, but teachers would either catch him drawing during class or he would skip class altogether to go out and observe other artists. During his short time in grammar school, Michelangelo made a friend who introduced him to Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was one of the most well-known painters of his time. Shortly after meeting this famous artist, Michelangelo began apprenticing under him, and was actually paid to do so. After working with Ghirlandaio for a couple of years, Michelangelo became acquainted with a man named Lorenzo de' Medici, who was a famous sculptor, and soon after discovering his work, Michelangelo became very infatuated with the idea of sculpting. Lorenzo allowed him to study all of his sculptures, and Michelangelo decided he was going to make an exact replica of one of these sculptures using marble. What you're actually looking at right now is the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici, which was sculpted by Michelangelo. Within the first 18 years of his life, Michelangelo carved the Battle of the Centaurs, the Madonna of the Stairs, and the Crucifix. Later in his life, he also completed the sculpture of David, which is one of his most famous pieces. In fact, some of the greatest controversies regarding Michelangelo stemmed from this particular sculpture. Michelangelo had a love for the physical body. He was determined to replicate every aspect of the human body in both his sculptures and his paintings, which may or may not reflect on the lifestyle he chose to live. Here's a fun fact. During the Counter-Reformation of 1545, something called the Fig Leaf Campaign took place, which required that the inappropriate aspects of his paintings and sculptures be covered up. Some of them were only temporarily covered, but some of them had to be permanently covered. Anyway, though David may have been his most famous sculpture, perhaps the work Michelangelo is most famous for is that of the Sistine Chapel, particularly the ceiling. The Pope himself summoned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling in his Vatican. This was a big deal because this was the area the Pope himself dwelled and was considered his most prized quarters. What was interesting about this is that at first, Michelangelo turned down the offer. He insisted that he was not a painter and that the Pope could find someone better suited to paint such an important and highly known place. But the Pope insisted that Michelangelo be the one to paint it, so he eventually accepted the challenge. Once Michelangelo agreed to paint this massive vault, he dedicated himself wholly to it. He was determined for it to be as perfect as it could be, and he drew up the blueprints for it himself. The Pope gave him an idea of what he wanted, but Michelangelo took it to the extreme. I believe that the Sistine Chapel is the greatest piece of work he ever completed, the one that sets him apart from all other artists. The amount of time, work, and physical pain that went into the painting of the ceiling is enough to make anyone appreciate it. The ceiling itself is measured to be somewhere around 132 by 45 feet and is covered in intricate and detailed paintings. Michelangelo spent 4 years of his life literally upside down painting these portrayals. 9 stories from the Book of Genesis are painted on the ceiling of this chapel, including creation, the fall of man, and Noah and the flood. In the portrayal of the creation, we see the separation between light and darkness, the creation of the sun and the moon, the separation between land and water, and the creation of Adam and Eve. Also portrayed is the temptation from the serpent, or Satan, to Eve and the fall of man. Another painting on this incredible ceiling is of the 12 prophets, 7 males and 5 females. The painting of the ceiling put Michelangelo through 4 of the most physically and spiritually painful years of his life. However, from 1537 to 1541, Michelangelo painted The Last Judgment. This was not on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but on the wall, right behind the altar. The Last Judgment is a depiction of the coming of Christ and the Apocalypse, which comes from the book of Revelation, the final book of the New Testament. What set Michelangelo apart from other artists of his time was his motive and his dedication. He put his whole heart into every project set before him, and this is clearly displayed throughout all of his artwork. Fine art is that in which the hand, the head, and the heart of a man go together. John Ruskin.